Hello, everyone. I'm Duarte, and welcome to our Mossy Earth podcast. Today, Matt, Tiago, and myself are discussing the features of our carbon footprint calculator, which Tiago developed for Mossy Earth. We recorded this in bits of 20 minutes due to limitations with our camera, so if you notice any cuts in the podcast, that is why. Also, because it was such a wonderful and sunny day, we decided to film it outside, so you might notice the occasional chirping of birds or the wind rustling the leaves of the trees. Unfortunately, we also made the poor decision of using some squeaky chairs, so our apology for any annoying noises. During this conversation, we go over the different research that forms the base for the carbon footprint calculator, as well as some of the interesting findings and nuances of the research. If you would like to read the methodology we are discussing, we have uploaded it to our website, and a link will be included below. I found this conversation to be really insightful, and I believe it complements our carbon calculator, the methodology page, and our low impact living guides really well. And I hope you'll find it insightful as well in your path towards reducing your impact on our ecosystems. Finally, we really appreciate any feedback you might have for us, so we encourage you to email us on the email we have provided in the description. Now, without further ado, let's get the conversation started.
So Tiago, you started by doing a bit of research around sort of the calculators that were out there, right?
Yeah, I did. The first thing I did was just like finding out what the existing calculators did, and sort of seeing what really the important features of the calculator were. And I started seeing exactly the pitfalls, the things that sort of made it important to do a new one, that sort of motivated us in this direction.
If you had to highlight like a few of the pitfalls that you encountered straight away.
So one of them would be certain calculators would not allow you to would require you to get information which would be difficult to get, and wouldn't allow you to get an estimate without doing that. For example, you really had to get electricity bills or things like that, so it was actually hard to use. And so the ideal scenario, which is what we tried to do, would be to provide people with the possibility of doing that if they want a really detailed assessment, but also having an estimate which is as accurate as possible without doing that. And sort of that compromise you were talking about in terms of being user-friendly and accurate, that was sort of hitting the right balance. That was one of the main pitfalls of other calculators.
Yeah, I imagine people, wanting to calculate their carbon footprint when they're on the tube or something, and you're not going to have access to your old bills or, what tariff you're on. Yeah, so.
And in a way, I think I always remember when I went through them, I was like, right, just give me an estimate that's close enough in some way, and I almost would feel a bit sort of bothered by the fact that they would ask me for a bill because I'd have to go sort out all these different things, and I was like, all right, surely we can get to something that's accurate enough without having to go through this whole process. But then again, as you said, there might be people that also want to use that information, so in a way, the way you built the calculator also includes that a little bit, right?
Yeah,
that
exactly.
Is part of the philosophy there.
Yeah, trying to adjust it to the people, like what they actually want to use it for. So it's a tool that, as much as possible, can be adjusted to how much you want to get out of it.
Maybe we got a bit ahead of ourselves. I might have said you should introduce yourself a little bit, explain a bit so how you came to work with us on this project, and where does the carbon calculator fit in your life?
Yeah, so my main occupation is I'm trying to start I'm starting my PhD now in Madrid, and I've always been interested in biology. I've always liked being in nature, always been concerned about the environment. And so I studied biology at the University of Edinburgh. Then I did some research scholarships. I spent some time doing fieldwork in Madagascar. And I've done a little bit of the different sides of things you can do in biology, from being like in the rainforest in Madagascar to doing like
the work you were doing in Madagascar. That was around population genetics.
Yeah, population genetics. Yeah,
and specifically,
so trying to understand how the fragmentation of habitat in Madagascar, how that affects populations of lemurs in Madagascar, and how that affects the genetics and all of that.
Maybe we need to do a podcast about that.
That'd be good. That'd be good.
And then, we obviously reached out to you because we felt like we are able to read a few scientific articles, we're able to interpret them, but we're not moving well in that field. It's hard for us to say. We've never worked in academia or anything similar. Both of us only have a bachelor's degree. So we thought it'd be useful for somebody to just grab it properly and really. I noticed a big difference when we started working on this project. It's just that you sort of start picking up on the articles much quicker, and you know where to search for all this information. I think that made.
Yeah, I think that's something as well, which so this is a very active field of research, and with anything that's an active field of research, if you want to get the cutting edge or the latest ideas, then you really need to go into the primary literature. So not just like going for the headlines or things like that. You really need to go and understand the studies and see which ones are the ones that you want to use. And that's also something like some of the calculators I saw, they were slightly out of date, or particularly because this is always changing. So
how up to date is the information that's available?
Sorry?
How up to date is the research? On
so it really depends on the different categories, because for some areas it's like a study from last year, for example, for diet, and maybe we'll talk about in a bit, where that really changed sort of the estimates we have about the effect of diet. But
would you say that on average most of the papers are from the last few years, or?
Yeah,
So
pretty much.
So say someone that works quite a bit within the scientific research world, would you say that these papers are on average quite recent? Because I assume there's like a vast amount being like put out right now, because it's a topic that people are so concerned about.
Yeah, the vast majority is quite recent, but then there are some other things which are sort of maybe they're not as trendy, and the best estimates you have are quite old. But it's always useful to like track and see what's the best we have, because that's always what it's about, right? It's not like saying it's the ultimate. It's really having the best available right now and finding it.
Yeah, I think that's something that I felt we really wanted to achieve with this calculator, which was to have it like as up to date as possible. We might keep on doing some work to keep it updated, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's an important part of it. Yeah.
I think that'll be to give it some longevity and to make sure that we stay as accurate as possible in the future. So if you're watching this 2 years from now, probably the calculator is still up to date.
Yeah, that's the goal for sure.
Cool. And did you have fun?
Yeah, it was for me like. I think one of the most interesting things about it was it felt like it's a subject I already knew quite a lot about, and then actually digging into the details, finding out like that things that I didn't know, or that many of the assumptions I had were incorrect, and so that really for me was really an interesting experience, and also like I had a better feeling of how useful it can actually be to do this kind of assessment, just by sort of, as I was doing the calculator, like applying it to myself to really understand which areas of your life you can like have an impact on.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it was sort of like a process, like both of building the calculator and then
so
like
there's a bit of self-growth in there as well.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was really
I think that's what a lot of our members will benefit from, is knowing where they should put their energy. You know,
for sure.
There's so many. There's a lot of advice out there of what we can do, but what's going to have a bigger impact.
Yeah, and I think that's very important for us to mention, is that we are not looking for people to do their carbon footprint estimation and then go, oh great, it's time to go plant a certain amount of trees with Mossy Earth. The idea really is to sort of stimulate this, go reduce your footprint and understand how your footprint breaks down across all these different categories, and see where the low-hanging fruit is and like where you can do the most. And that's sort of what we are looking for, because in the end, it's like we want the overall impact side of things.
And it's I always thought about that in the beginning as well, that people have a certain amount of energy they can dedicate to this,
and time.
So on the one hand, to research, it really takes a lot of time if you want to get to the bottom of like any one of the small issues of the calculator. Like if every person like is going to do that, it's very time consuming, and then also energy on making decisions, changes to your lifestyle. And then some of those changes, they can have a very small impact, and you can be feeling like you're contributing, but you're not. And so like really it can make such a huge difference to just have an assessment and decide like, okay, this is what I need to focus on.
Just to know what you're doing.
What you said, the low-hanging fruit, like small, some things can really have a big impact.
But for the people that want to dig a bit deeper, we are going to be releasing a proper methodology around around how you built this calculator, so that people can sort of understand the assumptions. And obviously we'll be discussing quite a few of them as well.
Yeah.
As well here.
Just coming back to a point you made, what were some of the surprises when you started digging?
So for me, like personally, for example, I was in general, we're quite concerned about electricity consumption, for example. Like, it's a classical thing you teach in school, right? You need to turn off the lights and everything.
Yeah.
And when I started digging deeper, I realized that in my case, for example, 100% of the tariff we use, it's 100% renewable. So if my goal for the year was to reduce my carbon footprint, and I just took the general idea of I just reduce my consumption, focus on that, without really paying attention, I could be investing my energy on something else. That's just like one example.
So, you know, the marginal gains you get from turning off the lights a bit more and really focusing on that, as opposed to, say, you know, changing your diet or going on all these other sort of categories.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, because that's something as well, is that you see all of these pictures. For example, you see in the world, transportation accounts for this percentage of the emissions. There's always all these statistics being thrown around, and people sort of build an intuition of what they need to do based on that. But it changes so much from person to person that those intuitions then don't really match up onto what is actually effective.
And that is when individual calculation really comes in handy for you to...
Yeah, exactly. Also, like, geographically, we, as much as possible, we try to like find data on different countries where it was relevant. We try to have emission factors which are specific to different countries, and that can really change as well what the most effective decision or change you can make is, depending on where you live.
It changes a lot across countries.
Yeah, for certain things, it's quite substantial. Like what the most effective measure would be. So also.
Do you have a concrete example of like what would be, so because, you know, some people might not necessarily relate their emissions to the, say, emissions of the country they live in. They might say, okay, but I'm optimizing much better than these people. Is there something that is inevitable because you're in that specific country that you are, you know, you take part in those wider emissions?
Yeah, what I mean is not like per capita emissions. So you live in the United States, and because the per capita emissions are higher in the United States, you get the higher per capita emissions. That's not what we did, because we actually want to focus on the things that people are doing and can change. Specific examples, the most concrete and perhaps important one is actually electricity emission factors, because it varies a lot. It varies a lot depending on how the electricity is produced, and that changes geographically. So even within the United States, for example, you have huge differences in the emission factors. So, for example, if you're in Vermont or Wyoming, Vermont, it's mostly clean energy. So your impact on reducing your footprint by reducing electricity consumption would be quite small. If you're in Wyoming, where it's mostly fossil fuel based production, then it could be a good way to reduce your footprint. So that's one example where it really.
We could touch on some of these as well when we go a bit more through.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Through all the different questions. Should we jump into the calculator side of things now? And should we start going through the details and the different questions?
Yeah, maybe just before we start, I could just mention sort of some of the challenges associated with estimating a carbon footprint in general.
Okay, yeah, I think that would be good.
So the idea with the carbon footprint is to actually get an estimate of all the CO2 or other greenhouse gas emissions that you are accountable for. So in order to make that estimation, you need to deal with several problems. One of them is the issue of accountability. Like, you need to decide what kind of activity is assigned to an individual, and that means things, for example, dividing the emissions of an airplane by all the passengers. So that's a part of sharing the accountability in a way. And with consumption, how you spend your money, the effects that has, or the whole chain of effects that has. So that's the part of accountability. Then the other part is actually associated with estimation, like actually having a good estimate of the average effect of a certain activity in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's where all the studies come in. And then there's also one issue with trying to estimate the whole carbon footprint of an individual, which is of having it be sufficiently complete, because it's a process which is biased towards being smaller. And what I mean is,
because you can't account for everything.
Yeah, so the things that you're missing out are biasing your footprint to be lower, you see? So
exactly. So the difference being that if you just work with really big averages, you can at least sort of get an estimate of what the average person would look like, and you get, because you're looking at the full picture of the emissions. But when you look at one individual footprint, you start breaking it down. If you're missing a block, it's going to be much lower.
Yeah, exactly.
So while you're building up that footprint, if you miss a category or if you miscalculate it a bit, then
Yeah, exactly. So that's something as well that these it's important to be aware that these estimates currently, at least, there is this uncertainty still, because in the end, while it seems simple, like the process of building emissions, estimating emission factors, to some extent it's quite simple, but untangling this whole web of accountability and all the small things which could result in emissions, it's far from solved. It's something that you need to work on still. Yeah.
But for the purpose of what we want to achieve here, which is to give people an accurate picture of their footprint and to tell them what direction to work towards, you believe it's fit.
For sure, and that's one thing as well, is that this uncertainty or things which we might not be accounting for, it's there, but it doesn't mean that we haven't covered the big chunk, which is essentially what's important in terms of making decisions, right?
Exactly. So as a decision-making tool, this covers it.
Then you start getting into finer and finer details, but this really gets the majority of the emissions. That's the idea. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so should we jump into the questions now, or?
Yeah. We can go through the different categories. All right. For sure. Yeah.
Do you wanna? I can pull out the questions, or do you want to go over the first question? I'm sure you know them.
Or I don't know if you want to go through the questions or the categories.
Let's go category by category and talk a bit about categories, and then each one of the sort of questions a little bit as well, if we can.
Yeah. So with the food, the main, the first question, and perhaps the main one is the one related to diet, and that was actually one of the ones where I found that really digging into the research was quite interesting and helpful, and changed what I saw, for example, on other calculators. Just to give a bit of a background, the way that generally you calculate the carbon footprint associated with a diet is that you need to know essentially two things. On average, someone who consumes a certain diet, say a vegetarian diet or a self-reported vegetarian diet, what kinds of food products do they eat and in what amounts, right? Mm-hmm. That's one of the things you need to know. And then you need to know, for each of those food products, what's the average net emissions of greenhouse gases associated with that food product.
So when you talk about net emissions, there's also sort of a conversion between other types of greenhouse gases, and we eventually convert everything to CO2. Was that?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So each different greenhouse gases, they have different potential, global warming potential.
Global warming potential. That was it.
Yeah.
So that's the unifying metric.
Yeah,
for all of them.
Exactly. You see, if it were CO2, how much warming would it generate? That's the idea.
Okay. Okay.
So that's important as well. So the units you get, it's CO2 equivalent. It's on that measure. So
CO2, the little E.
The little E. Yeah. So if you have a big chunk of emissions from methane, for example, from eating meat and dairy, then you still get that as a CO2 equivalent.
Okay. So it would be essentially the global warming effect of the methane, but then in CO2. So how much CO2 would be required to get the same heating effect as that amount of methane?
Yeah,
okay,
that's it.
Perfect.
That's it. And that really makes everything easier, right? Unifying everything. So I was explaining about food, right? So you have the way that these emissions associated with each food product are calculated is by doing life cycle assessment, which is you really follow the whole life cycle of the product from production to end of life, and you estimate emissions associated with the whole process. And traditionally, when people have done these studies, they have not taken into account the effect of land use change. So land use change is the changes in the landscape associated with producing food, and it's long been recognized that this was an important missing chunk of the emissions of food production.
Can you give a couple of examples of land use change for food?
So, for example, if you cut down a forest to produce a crop there, the net effect that has on the carbon sink that was already there, that's an example of a land use change.
And how do they go about nowadays estimating an average figure for that?
Yeah, so actually the estimates we use, they're from a really interesting study which uses a model that on the one hand takes into account what I mentioned, which is the net effect of producing food there, but it goes even one step further, which is that it also measures the opportunity costs of leaving the land alone. So if you stop producing your crop and left, what carbon would be stored?
Positive effect
Yeah.
that would have.
Yeah. And
From an economic perspective,
yeah,
it's quite
it's-
interesting.
yeah,
it's like
it
a
is
whole
really-
opportunity cost.
exactly,
around
that's what
there.
they do. Yeah. And
Oh,
for
wow.
example, if you have a chunk of land where it's very effective to produce a certain crop, then by doing that you're also
In a way, that becomes a net positive
Net
because it's a
positive.
very efficient place to do so.
exactly.
Oh wow!
Because that way you don't need to produce it elsewhere, and the
Mm.
total amount of land you need to produce food for the global population is smaller. So it really takes these things into account, and it's interesting.
You'll be including links for all these articles in the methodology, I assume.
Yeah. I
So
will.
people can dig a bit
He is
deeper.
now.
He is now.
Yeah.
No, he was already.
no,
here.
they're there.
He was already. I was gonna ask you like if you know the names of these guys, but no, they're brilliant people. I like this idea from
Yeah.
like, a numbers perspective. It's quite cool.
Yeah, from reading different studies, I really felt like it was a step forward, and it's not like something they come up with. It was a gap that was recognized in the literature. So when you read, for example, UN reports on the emissions associated with food, you see like the caveat, like okay, but we're not considering land use change. So it's always there, but and then now people are starting to address it.
That's brilliant. And does it change a lot of the metrics did you find?
Yeah, a big chunk. So one result is that the emissions are higher because
Yeah.
it was something that was being not really being
Mm.
considered, and also it really increases the difference between animal products and plant-based food. Essentially because the production of animal products requires more land. So for example, ruminant meat and things like that, they really have a large effect regarding land use change. That's one of the findings. Yeah.
So, in terms of the general conclusions for this sort of first question for how diet impacts your footprint, what is the overarching result you can take away from this question?
So the overall result is that reducing the amount of animal products that you can consume, that you consume, really can be a large reduction of your carbon footprint. And including this latest research means that reduction is higher than sometimes estimated.
Because of, say, clearing the Amazon with the Amazon fires we've seen recently for cattle production, for instance.
Yeah. That's the.
And then sort of in between the different animals, there's also wide variation. I remember us digging into this or reading an article between, say, the difference between white and red meat is quite big as well.
Yeah. Because ruminants they produce large amounts of methane, and methane is a very powerful
Right.
greenhouse gas.
And
so,
ruminants, that would be lamb, cow.
all the ones that feed on grass essentially, and
Okay.
and
Grass specifically.
Yeah.
Okay.
Those would be and so then because they produce methane, and methane is such a powerful greenhouse gas, then that amounts to a large chunk of food production emissions. Yeah.
And is it the methane that they're producing, or it's the change in land use, or it's a combination of the both? Or?
It's both, yeah. So what I mean, so before including these land use change
There was
estimates,
already,
there's already a huge difference.
Mm.
yeah.
And then if you put this on top, that difference increases.
Okay, so if we then keep on going through the calculator in terms of diet, what's sort of the next big thing that you would look at?
So perhaps the next most important thing is food waste. Food waste, at the level of the consumer, the way that it can be associated with emissions is, on the one hand, because food that you throw away has to be disposed of, and all that process is associated, and it decomposes, and that whole process is associated with emissions. But the biggest chunk of the emissions associated with food waste is simply by increased consumption. So if you could buy less food and still meet your needs,
Okay.
then you'd really reduce your footprint. So that's the largest.
So wasting food
spend.
isn't as bad as the decomposing side of things.
No, the main chunk is
main chunk is what you bought extra and you just threw away.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, which sometimes seems counterintuitive because it's
And-
already there, but in the end, on the long term, what matters is like
Sure.
how much food goes in.
And would you say that certain things make you waste more food? So is this about the food that we throw in the bin at home, or is this about going to a restaurant or eating at a buffet? You know, maybe because restaurants waste more food or something like this. I think it might be something worth considering when people are going through the calculator.
The focus is generally more on a per household
Okay.
effect, and it's worth, of course, like if you tend to eat out, to sort of try to seek that information, try to see if how sustainable the different places you might eat are, but from the household perspective. The one thing to keep in mind as well is that it's worse to waste food whose production has more emissions associated with it. So it's not always the same
If you're
impact.
wasting
Yeah.
tons of red meat. Then,
Yeah,
you
that's
know,
like
okay.
if you're doing
It's a
that,
big
like
no-no.
you're really like
No, no, yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So to some extent the effect of waste is quite simple. It's just higher consumption, higher emissions. But it can still have a big impact. So it's something to be mindful of. Yeah.
And when I was going through the calculator on the part about waste, how much goes to waste. What if you're home composting? Does that have an effect?
So with regards to the what I was saying, that the main chunk is related to consumption, it would not help with that part, right? So if you're throwing
Unless you're grooming your garden as well.
Yeah.
yeah. But I mean, of course, you then help with the part of the transport and disposal of the
Sure.
waste. Yeah.
So at least you reduce that side of things a bit.
Yeah. Exactly.
But
if
more
you
importantly, it's that
yeah
you're not throwing it.
So if
out.
you're buying a ton of red meat and then composting it,
no,
probably not great.
not advisable. No.
All right, and then in terms of the, because we've heard a lot in the past about sourcing food locally and those food miles, right, or the miles essentially to get food to your table. How much of an impact does that have in sort of eating locally? That's another part covered.
Yeah. So that was an interesting part for me as well, because I always had this image that like one of the main or the big chunk of the emissions associated with food were related to its transport, and I think there's a lot of people talking about food miles and the importance of eating local.
The term has definitely already sort of entered into pop culture, and you hear a lot of eating local as being like a bigger thing than how you eat, for an instance.
Yeah.
Does this come back to the point you made previously about these areas that are more efficient to produce a type of food?
It does, yeah, it does link to that, but we'll get that to that point in a bit. But so the thing, so recent studies, like if you look at the recent studies on this, they estimate that it can account between like 6 or 11%, depending on on that range of percentage of the total emissions of food consumption.
So still very much a relevant aspect to take into
It is
account.
relevant, yeah. That's why we include the question.
Obviously,
Yeah. But it's not always a straightforward effect, which is what you were referring to. And there's a few reasons for this. One is that in some places it's more efficient to produce certain types of food. So sometimes it can actually be more efficient to produce something somewhere else and have it come to you than to produce it locally. The classic example is with the greenhouses. A heated greenhouse in Northern Europe to produce tomatoes is very inefficient compared to bringing them from Spain, for example.
So then the sort of the best options would be either you bring them from Spain or you don't eat them at all, in a way.
Yeah,
If
exactly.
you're looking at the most efficient options. You'd eat something like a potato or...
Yeah, and eating seasonally. That's where eating seasonally comes in, so that you're not
Okay.
producing things in an inefficient way.
But do you think that realistically, I mean, obviously it boils down to personal choices in the end, right? But as a sort of the market as a whole, it might be very hard to get people to sort of get into that rhythm of eating seasonally again, because everybody just demands everything all the time now.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, if you're willing to make the effort, I think it can be worth it as well to add
Tastes
some
better
variety.
as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. Things that are ripe, add some variety.
You eat a lot seasonally, right, Matt? You sort
Yes.
of- so-
It's put upon me by my partner. No, but yeah, we've got food charts at home, and it doesn't take that long to get into it either. And especially if you start going to local markets, talking to people, local producers, and then you start. I mean, I've got a small, modest raised bed, and once you go out, to buy seeds, etc., you then start realizing what's planted when, and it doesn't take long to get your head around it. I mean, if I can do it, anyone can do it. But I'm thinking, like, if a member's listening and they're walking into a shop or a market, and they're trying to remember all the things that we're discussing on the podcast, what would be more important, buy locally or eat seasonally?
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Ideally both, but
Yeah. So the thing is,
why seasonally you're probably buying a bit more local, right? Because there would be such a supply in the region for that specific season.
Yeah,
But because the avocado season in New Zealand won't have an effect on avocados you're buying here.
Yeah, so it's because it's the interaction of the two things that determines the impact. That's why we don't have separate questions as well. It's because it's by doing both that you can reduce the impact.
Yeah.
So it's not easy to disentangle the two and say this much can be saved by doing this and this by doing that. It's actually like the actual product you consume, like the footprint it has.
So do both.
Yeah,
both.
essentially that's what it boils down to. Yeah.
But when we look at diet as a whole, it's much bigger to drop animal products.
Much bigger. Yeah.
Specifically the ruminant side of things, your lambs and your beefs and your milk.
The difference is huge. So what we were talking about, like devoting energy, if you want to focus on diet, definitely focus on that. And also even just changing what we talk about, red to white meat can have a huge impact. And so
do you have an idea of the factor almost, if you had to sort of off the top of your head?
Yeah, it would be. I mean, I would have to check, but you could save. I would say like 3 to 2 tons, like just with that change, and it goes.
But sort of in terms of the ratio, would it be how many times less for that diet? So if you ate a kilo of beef versus like a kilo of chicken, do you have an idea?
Out of the top of my head, I'm not sure, but like the difference is quite big, yeah. Because of all the reasons we talked about, like the land use change and the methane and all of that.
Brilliant. Okay.
And just going back to the food miles that we started off, how's most food transported around the world? Is it boat, plane?
Yeah, so there's a lot of it is by boat, like there's a lot of transport by boat, and then of course there's a distribution to different places by land, and then some of it actually air travel, and that's
something
air
gets
transport,
flown, like salmon or something like that.
Yeah, and that's something, one of the things as well to be aware of is that even though it's a very small percentage of products that are transported by air, they have a very large footprint.
Sure.
So you can be mindful of that, and just that particular thing can be an easy way to.
Would be brilliant if they were sort of required to label that.
That's the.
Isn't it labeling would do half of the work?
That's the biggest thing that I think could change, like at the global scale. The impact
life cycle impact.
It should be there because
Yeah.
people now are very aware and they want to choose the right thing, but they don't know. Like there's so much information and they don't know what to choose.
Sure.
I'd be curious to know what it has done, sort of, the not the calorie reporting, but actually putting colors in those labels, whether it has made a big change. But I imagine something like this would be sort of, you're not even playing whether, if somebody sees something that's quite caloric, they still want to eat it because it's, delicious. But this specifically, they could just start choosing between products that they like equally. It's just that one's got a much lower footprint.
Yeah, I think that would be like, it's very promising because that information exists, like there's of course loads of products which have not been assessed, but the technology, the methodology to make those estimates, it exists, and it would really have a big impact.
Yeah, I'd really like to see that in the supermarket one day.
I think something visual and easy, it helps the shopper. I mean, you imagine a mum, she's on the school run, she's then got to go to the supermarket, got 3 kids hanging off a trolley, she hasn't got time to read the small print on the back. It needs to be something visual they can see and okay, there's a huge difference between this fruit and this fruit.
Yeah. I think that would be very cool to see.
Alright, while we're chatting about miles, move on to the next topic in the calculator.
Sure, yeah. Transport. The other one. So with transport, one of the important parts is flights. With flights, it's really impressive how, like, in one day, like, you take one flight and how much that impacts your yearly footprint if you take a long flight, right? So that's one area which has always receives quite a bit of attention because it's very clear how the emissions are associated with your activity, and so of course we had to include that as well, and we tried to make it as easy as possible for people to, if you look back on 1 year, to sort of input your mileage to get an estimate out of it.
So we didn't include sort of specific miles. Don't go in and type in your miles or kilometers or.
No, yeah, just because again, like to make it user friendly, that you can like essentially recall, and that already gives you a very good.
So the way you did it was by different categories, right?
Yeah, like short flights, medium flights, and so on. Yeah.
I remember during one of our catch-up calls when you were doing the research, there was a difference between whether you fly economy, business class, first class, and remind me what was the...
Yeah, so for me that was another thing which for me was very interesting, that when you think about it, it makes sense, but it wasn't like
So
obvious
obvious.
at the start. Yeah, that the emission factor when you fly economy class is much lower than if you fly first class, for example. The idea there is that if your seat takes up more space, there couldn't be as many people in the plane if everyone had the same
So
seat
if
as
everyone
you.
was first class, it'd be like half the people there.
Yeah, exactly. And so you'd have to divide the emissions of the of that traveling just by the people who are on the plane. So and the difference is actually very big. So it's quite important. And I never heard someone tell me like how to reduce your carbon footprint. Don't fly first class. That's something I never heard of.
That's quite big, yeah.
Yeah, and it really like can half, I would say, like it's the difference.
Half
if
the
I recall
footprint of flying.
the emission factor like per
Oh.
kilometer. It's like
Wow.
So everyone who flies first class and is a Mossy Earth member, you go economy now.
Cattle class, I think.
Cattle class along with everyone else.
yeah, but in the end, like the maths, I mean, it's not complicated. Just look at the space it takes.
Sure.
And
Yeah,
just think
sure.
how many
Yeah, no,
seats could be
it's-
there. It makes
yeah.
sense
It's
that
a clear
it's half.
economic thing, yeah.
Yeah.
And is there a difference between short haul, long haul, medium haul? I noticed that on the calculator.
Yeah. So there are some differences because of additional because taking off and landing takes up more fuel per kilometer than when you're in cruise mode. But differences that they're not very big, and it's not always easy to incorporate them. So what we've done is we've taken an estimate which already takes an average of all different types of flights,
Sure.
and that already accounts for
Okay.
the in general.
So we separate the categories in the calculator more so people can remember it a bit easier. How
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I think what we did previously with our sort of carbon offsetting product on our website was to have people just input the amount of hours, the total amount. I think it might have become a bit confusing once you're reaching, say, a larger amount of hours. And I think this way probably is easier for people to remember. Oh yeah, I did 2 medium trips, 1 long trip, and 1 short trip, and that's
Yeah,
it.
that was sort of the idea, that you could sort of quickly build it up on your head and have an idea of the.
And completely not related to the calculator, but have you heard of any sort of changes towards, say, a taxation for aviation, or maybe electric aviation, to sort of solve this problem? Because the demand's not going to go away. People want to zip to the other side of the world, while we can sort of lead by restricting our flights a bit more. Is this something that globally is only going to increase?
Yeah, actually, like on that side of things, because I focused mainly on the personal side of things. So the whole some of these like policy changes that might be coming, I'm not like as aware of. But it definitely is one of those areas which for some people that they really need to fly, that they might feel a bit trapped, like of like not knowing what to do. So if some solution like that comes up, it would really have a.
Yeah, I heard about some Norwegians starting some electric flights, starting commercially 2025, something like this. But maybe I need to go read that again.
Yeah.
I was reading something recently as well. I think it's 20% or 20% of all emissions from planes are from the frequent flyers. So they were looking at maybe focusing on taxing those frequent flyers is to see if that could make a difference.
But things like business travel, where people just go somewhere to have a meeting, whether they could have that meeting on Skype. I think for a lot of people that got to travel for work, that might be one of the things. That might be some low-hanging fruit right there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And
Also, like a cultural change to sort of accept that more.
Yeah.
Like,
I've personally been flying quite a bit the last 2 years, and I'm gonna be removing that for next year probably by about, I don't know, 90% or something. So that'll be significant.
Yeah.
But
So do the estimation now and then do it afterwards as well to
I can see some
how it
progression.
changes. Yeah.
And economy, remember?
Matt, I'm always going first. Well, can't go in cattle class. Cool. I think that sort of wraps it up for
Flights.
the flight sort of area. Right?
Yeah. The next bit is transport. Like the rest of the transport category is more associated with commuting. The idea with that section, because it's difficult to incorporate every single transport you've taken in a year, right? So the idea is that we focus on commuting, which is things that people do quite often, and so that we thought would be the best way to sort of.
I mean, it's hard to suit everyone's sort of transport needs, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you can get an idea by focusing on the most frequent journeys you take.
Which would be 90-something% of the people. they do a form of a regular
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
travel.
So with that, it's also, I mean, there's nothing like very special about it except perhaps for electric cars. So for other things with the petrol car, for example, you have an estimate of how much the emissions associated with driving a certain number of kilometers, and based on the answers to the questions in the calculator, we can get obtain that value. For electric cars, it comes down to what we were talking about before, that how green electricity changes a lot in different places, and we've incorporated.
So if you're firing up your Tesla with some coal electricity, then it doesn't make much of a difference, does it?
Exactly.
Potentially worse because of energy loss.
I mean, there are a few situations where it's worse because also electric cars they're more efficient as well. So, but still, it really in some places it can really reduce your footprint. In other places, not really. Yeah.
And in the transportation side of things, I think I remember asking you this question before we did the podcast around the building of the vehicle that you're using. That is to some extent also accounted in the footprint of that specific vehicle, or
yeah. So sometimes there are emission factors per mile which take into account the average lifespan of a vehicle and sort of divided by the mileage, if that makes sense. But I thought a more straightforward way of accounting for this is just to take into account when you actually buy the vehicle, the average production of that kind of vehicle.
Yeah.
And if you bought it this year, you have an idea of what the effect was of buying it. I think it's more transparent than having these estimates per kilometer, so that you know what things you did that really had a certain impact. I think it makes it easier to then act on it. Yeah.
It's kind of topical because on the way to the podcast today, my 25-year-old car blew up, and we were having this discussion: is it better for the environment that I keep plugging on with this old 25-year-old car because it's been built, or should I replace it with an electric car which is going to have a carbon footprint to build?
Yeah, and there is a line where that decision sort of.
as someone that can run as much as you do, I think you should run everywhere now.
Yeah, it'd be greener, I suppose.
100 miles this way, 100 miles that way. Should be okay. So now that we sort of covered the diet side of things, the transport side of things, we get into the next category of questions, which is around people's homes.
Yeah.
And what are the sort of the big assumptions around here? And
yeah, so there are the two parts of the issue are: one, estimating your consumption of a certain type of energy, because in the home the main source of emissions is the energy, and then estimating you need to estimate the consumption and then know how the emissions associated with that consumption. So one part of this was actually creating an up-to-date database of the emission factor for electricity in different countries and, when possible, states, so that the portion of your footprint that's associated with electricity consumption actually reflects what's happening in your case.
and will people be able to sort of say if they've got green energy?
Yeah.
Okay, because I know, for instance, in the UK, I remember in London, you'll see the ads everywhere going you can switch to 100% green energy, or mostly green energy, and you can switch your provider and pay maybe a little bit more, but
you can do that, and as I was mentioning, I think that's one easy way of reducing your footprint.
Low hanging fruit there.
Yeah, for sure. And also the prices are becoming more and more competitive, so that it can actually in some cases it can pay off to make that change. So while before sometimes you'd be paying more to get green energy, now you can sometimes save both money and reduce your footprint.
Yeah.
So it's a win-win.
And do you think some of them might be, when you look at, because I remember looking at some different companies, and some would rely heavily on, say, biofuels, or do you know that if in general they are using a lot of clean energy, if they report it quite clearly, or?
Yeah, so that's interesting as well, because of course when you say it's renewable green energy, it's worth digging a little bit deeper
into that claim,
into that area, because there's always the caveat that there are other impacts other than the emissions associated with the energy. And for example, I was speaking about my case that it's at my where I'm living now, I'm using 100% renewable, but I can find on the bill on the website exactly where
What that means.
where it came from. So
Mm.
I sent them a message, and now I'm waiting for a reply on actually like to understand where it actually comes from. Yeah.
Actually, as part of the Mossy membership in the low impact living guides, we've got a nice guide on green energy, and in there you can really dig deep into all the providers and at what percentage they, what's their renewable energy based on. Practical guide on how you can change your energy provider. So yeah, worth checking out.
When you went through the process of writing that one, did you see sort of certain renewable energy providers offer, say, less renewable options in their mix, or would they have such a more renewable mix, but not?
Yeah, there were some surprises, and some, doing my research, some wouldn't be so transparent as to how they were putting their renewable energy together, and others were really laying their cards on the table, saying this is where we get it from. So yeah, worth.
You remember one of the sources that would sneak through, or?
No, not off the top of my head. It was,
okay.
It was some time ago.
No worries. Well, guys, go check out that guide. I'm sure it'll be all the information will
Enlightening.
Yeah,
it'll be enlightening.
definitely very useful, given that it can really have a big impact. Yeah.
So that would be sort of one of the other big out of the three categories we've spoken so far. That's like a big low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and in terms of the way we built the calculator, I would say that it also is more user-friendly than some other calculators, because one thing that I didn't try to do would be to ask many questions to try and estimate electricity consumption, and instead people have two options. Either they look at their bill, where they actually have that value written down exactly, and they get the perfect estimate, or we get the country average, and they can say whether it's above or below average.
Oh, exactly. So this gives people, say, I don't know my energy bill right now. I've not been living in a place for a while, but if I could estimate that, say I'm probably below average for the country where I'm living, I could then report this in the calculator and would give a more accurate than usual estimate.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something I thought was missing in other calculators from
because they just ask you to input your bill or just average.
No, or they try to estimate your consumption based on many questions related, for example, how the size of the home, whether it's a flat, if it's, and then you'd be answering like many questions on this topic, while maybe it's easier actually to either get your bill, or so it seems like it's a lot of effort in terms of like trying to estimate something that you can get precisely by getting the bill, or get a reasonable approximation by
with
using country averages.
Yeah, I remember in the past sort of bailing out on calculators online because of that. That would be the bottleneck for me. The moment I had, such detailed questions about my energy consumption at home, it was just like, no, that's too much, and I wrapped. So
yeah,
because it also doesn't even apply to everyone,
Yeah, and it's
not everyone has an electricity bill, so
yeah, that as well. Yeah, and it is a difficult thing to estimate because there's so many factors. Like, if you for example, if you try to estimate your consumption using one of those calculators and then look at your bill, the chances are there will still be a good difference, So that's why it doesn't seem like a very useful way of spending your energy on.
But it's good because people can go bill or default to average / above, below, depending. So what would be the biggest factor there? Would you say if somebody has got a mansion, then they really got to think, okay, I'm for sure above average. If somebody's got a tiny sort of one, like studio somewhere in a city, they're probably below average. Is it something a lot about house size, or would you say it's about your house, the way you use it, or?
House size is very important, and I would say heating is the second most important thing. So if you live in a cold country and you need to heat your home for a lot of the year, and you maintain it at a very high temperature.
Is it average for within the country, or is it average like globally? Probably within the country, right? You said.
Yeah, for all the countries we could find, it's like the country average household consumption.
So then you got to think whether you're above, below, or at the average within your country.
Yeah, which is easier than global, which you have no idea.
Where do I fit in? Compared to, I don't know, someone heating their home in Indonesia or something like this.
No, you don't have to do that. Yeah.
No, okay, that's a good shout. Yeah.
Cool. And of course, then something worth mentioning as well, with respect to the emissions associated with the home, is that we divide it by the number of people living there. So of course it's one of those things that the sharing emissions. It's also a principle that I think it's very important to have in mind. because if you have someone else living with you, in terms of accountability, you're only accountable for half of the emissions in that home.
Yeah.
So it's like it's not something you immediately think about, but like half the emissions, that's pretty good, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
with sharing rides as well. For example, now going to Madrid, I always try to travel with a car sharing app. Yeah, and that's also a very simple way. Like you both make money and you really slash your footprint for the trip. So
Yeah.
sharing things, it's pretty good for your.
Can't share flights though.
You already do. That's the thing.
I know what
Yeah.
you do to
And
the
you can
max.
share with more people in theory, or at least
by not taking first class.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, brilliant.
But there's always subtleties as well. Like if you all the planes that exist already have first class seats built into them, like it's not completely clear that by not flying first class, like that will. But you need to
But
think
from an economic perspective, you'd say that if demand stops for first class seats, they won't build the next plane like
that's
that.
the point.
So,
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah.
Economically speaking, just always choose what's right and what's best in general, and you'll probably end up shaping the world in that direction.
Yeah, that's the principle for
Yeah.
sure.
So I love economics.
Yeah.
Okay.
Households, does it touch on pets?
Yeah, or I mean, pets. We've included them because they eat largely meat-based food, and so even though they're quite small and they don't eat as much, or sometimes it can add to
I mean, if
a
they're having
significant
2
footprint.
meat meals a day, that's
Yeah.
consumption, isn't it?
It's substantial, yeah. So in that case, actually, the research is still like there's not that much research yet, so it's not that easy. But I found some studies, and actually the study I found included an estimate for both cats and dogs, so they're not differentiated. But it gives you an idea of what that area of your life like.
So we're not differentiating the Chihuahua and the Great Dane, but
For example, yeah.
but
yeah.
you know, for now, I mean,
Hopefully,
maybe if you have a Great Dane, just put 2 dogs instead of 1, and you probably get a desirable outcome there.
Yeah, yeah.
Hey, that's the way to think about it, you know.
Yeah.
If your dog's twice as big as the average dog, then
Hopefully, when more information is available, we can incorporate that.
we'll add the dog species in there.
That would definitely be the first calculator to include that.
To include dog species, yeah. And is there anything you can do to reduce your animal's footprint? I know that cats really do need to eat meat. Dogs is a bit of a mix, isn't it?
No, I mean dogs. You can. I mean, I'm not pushing for anyone to have a vegan dog, but my dog is vegan and is healthy and runs with me a lot. So it is possible. You do research, it is possible. But yeah, I know cats need to eat meat. I mean, I've actually started writing a low impact living guide about pets and pet foods, and also even the toys they have. You know, suddenly you start looking at you know, plastic toys have a footprint, and you can eradicate those. You don't need plastic.
I mean, a dog can play with a lot
Yeah,
of things.
yeah,
Doesn't
yeah.
probably need the chewy toy.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
dog will chew everything, so we don't need to go and buy
Oh, they'll chew already
plastic toys
chews.
for it.
Yeah. So it's just,
Yeah, there's another something I come up with, which is that if you buy certain foods that don't really require the food to be produced, so it's like things like waste, certain types of waste, then that's another way of reducing the footprint. So for example,
like a butcher's waste. For
yeah,
your
things
Yeah.
which
cat.
would not be
Yeah.
consumed otherwise, then that's another way of reducing
Yeah.
the footprint. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to my grandmother recently, and she was saying, you know, dogs would only ever get what was the food scraps from
Yeah.
the rest of the meal. You know.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one way. If because I don't know how widely available they are, but if you can find it, it would really reduce the footprint associated.
Yeah, going back to that food waste.
I mean, your own scraps. That's probably that's easy. But yeah, going to the butcher, if you're buying it from them, it's still adding economic value. So technically speaking, it would add to the value of the meat. So it'd be slightly different. But if they're just giving it to you, then you're.
Which I think local butchers
Might,
might. I've got some friends that get butcher's meat. The only trouble is how regular that is. You know, can you rely on it? But then you know, take it whenever, and it's better than
And then
nothing.
freeze it
I suppose.
and take it out for the cat when
Yeah.
Though cats might be a bit picky. But those little cat food thingies there, that's all meat as well, isn't it?
I think it varies quite a bit, but it's like a mix of like fish as well, and there's all kinds of
weird
things
stuff in there.
But yeah, again, like just to give a bit of perspective, like this is not a big part of the footprint.
Yeah,
It's something we've included.
It's
Also,
just an
because
interesting topic.
people are also curious about it, like,
Yeah.
and so it's interesting to have an idea of the impact of these things. Yeah.
Brilliant. Should we move on to the sort of next category? which would be sort of other habits, right? So,
Yeah,
or do you have somewhere you'd like to wrap up on the home?
No, I think the home, that's it pretty much. And then we've just sort of have a final category, which is more just to take into account things that weren't included in other ones, and mainly, for example, consumption, things you buy. So as with food, things you buy, they have a whole life cycle.
So we're talking about phones, clothing, shoes,
Yeah.
cars, everything.
Yeah. So everything will have some sort of a footprint associated with it, and so we try to include questions that estimate that. So one of them is associated with clothing, and so this has also received much attention. So the issue with the fast fashion, many issues associated with it, and so we try to have an idea of how many items of clothing you buy per year, and then assuming a certain emissions associated with that item, we get an overall estimate.
And
Just looking at the carbon footprint of an item of clothing, is it more in the production, or is it when it's dumped and goes into landfill and then produces toxic greenhouse gases, or is
I think
combination of
with
the two?
clothing, I think the majority is with the production, and then when you read about the carbon footprint of clothing, then there's also an important part, which is the use. So how you wash it, for example, if you wash it at a higher temperature and things like that. But we've not incorporated that in this section because that would be already covered in the home area, because that's your energy consumption.
Yeah.
So you could be doubling down on it, which wouldn't be desirable.
No, not good.
Yeah.
But to mention that as well, so when we're talking about energy and home and all that, so we try to estimate the footprint here, but then if people actually want to reduce consumption, then the low impact living guides would be the way to go. So with many of these things, like it's not exactly the advice that to change it is not included, but you have an idea of where you can act, and then specific actions you can
Follow through on the guides, and we'll be adapting a lot of our guides to really match everything, and we'll probably be going back through your research and your methodology and putting it as sources for a lot of the guides as well, so that we really match those two together quite neatly, and so that also that the outcomes of the calculation that people receive give them something actionable. So if your diet footprint's quite high, you can go here to see guides on how to reduce your diet's footprint, things like that. So really trying to link both and link it into action, as I said, and not just tell people to plant trees, because we really want people to lower their carbon footprint.
And not only lowering carbon footprint, we were talking earlier, weren't we, that clothing, one part of clothing has a CO2 footprint, but also has an ecological footprint.
Yeah.
It's not counted for in a carbon calculator, but that's something in our low impact living guides that we're trying to sort of highlight, is that some of the ecological effects that the clothing industry has, poisoning rivers, etc.
So that's
where
that's another thing, right? Well, ultimately, in the perfect world, we'd have a calculator which would mix the CO2 and the ecological impact, wouldn't it? But that's just next level stuff.
Yeah. So it's very interesting, because what we're experiencing right now, it's like an ecological crisis. It's global warming is a part of it, but there's a whole dimension of things that are happening.
The whole plastic side of things, it's bad at consumption, but afterwards might do even more damage, which isn't accounted for in our footprint.
Yeah.
So that bottle, it's only a certain amount of greenhouse gases to create it, but then once it's in the ocean killing everything, it's it's a no different ecological.
So it's important as well, like as a caveat to the calculator, to continue to pay attention to those things, because you can't just make decisions based on one thing, and then if it has negative impacts on the other. So when you were speaking about clothing, the carbon footprint is perhaps not as high as I expected from what I read about the impact of fast fashion and all that, but the reason is that there's so many other impacts that it really can have a large impact on average on a global scale if you're buying a lot of clothing.
Within this category of the other part of the consumption side of things is all these items we buy. I remember suddenly seeing all these shocking statistics about what our smartphones and our computers do, and I mean they're so essential to our work that I don't think twice about buying them. But I mean, are they a big deal, and how big of a big deal are they? And
So for example, a smartphone, the production, it's not very big, but it is something, and more so with a desktop computer, for example, a slightly higher footprint. But I think it's worth thinking about it also in terms of choices, in terms of the what you buy. If you want to buy something that will last you a long time, that's a good way of it's one of the best ways as well to reduce your footprint in this area. So if a computer is something that you definitely need, we include it and you see that it has an impact on your footprint. Like the best way of reducing this is actually just buying a good one and taking good care of it and ensuring that you just don't keep buying more and more. And with smartphones in particular, this is
The annual.
yeah, people now like they break them very easily, or they're already expecting to get the next new model. And so even though it's not it will not be a huge part of your footprint, it's something that you can keep in mind.
And it touches on what we were just talking about with clothing, doesn't it? I mean, a smartphone has an ecological footprint as well, you know.
Yeah.
With the mining of these precious metals, etc.
Yeah. So this aspect of trying to reduce how many you buy will then have also reduce all of those issues associated with the production of electronics. And then also we mentioned already, but with cars, different cars have different types of car, have different life cycle emissions, or the production emissions associated with them.
There's this sort of always this story going around about electric cars having such a ginormous footprint when they're built compared to a regular car. Did you find any information on this?
Yeah, it is. They do have a higher footprint, but the latest studies I found on this, they find that in the great majority of cases, like, it still pays off, like in the long run.
In the long run,
if you
okay.
take out the buying the car and
Also because
and using it.
maintenance is much lower, as far as I understand, for an electric car.
Yeah.
You don't need to replace all those different parts of the engine of that.
Yeah, the only thing, like, batteries need to be replaced, and because batteries are the one of the main like the production of batteries is one of the main sources of the production emissions.
So it all boils down in the end to battery technology improving.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, yeah.
I think also I was doing some research on it. I think some of these articles also forget that an electric car, it also eliminates the air pollution side of things. I mean, in big cities, air pollution is a big problem.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah.
Place like London, where
Yeah.
you start seeing in children's lungs, it's not.
Yeah.
We should definitely, like, that should be a big deal as well.
Yeah.
And if you said it, so in the long run, if you had to tell people to make a decision, if they can afford it and if it works for their commute and so on, buy an electric car.
Yeah, but on that point, I would add two things. One is that it also depends on where you're going to be getting your
Plugging that
electricity
in,
from,
yeah.
like essential. Have that in mind.
Completely essential. Okay.
Yeah, and then also, of course, considering the possibility of living car free.
Oh
of
yes,
course.
big cities. Yes.
Because
completely
sometimes, like,
right,
on
yeah.
this discussion of like, what's the most efficient car I'm going to buy? If you can consider the possibility of living
Yeah.
car free, just take this whole production emissions. You take that out. So
And
Yeah.
same thing. If always best to still have a car if you can share it at least most of the times compared to say having motorcycles and.
although the emission factors in general for motorcycles are quite small, yeah, you need to take those are the factors you need to take into account. Like,
Because on average, a car isn't that full, is it? Usually, on average, a person drives alone, so just
Yeah.
polluting more than a motorcycle, but alone.
exactly. So that's what you need to take into account,
Mm.
like whether you'll be sharing and how efficient the vehicle is. Yeah.
No electric motorcycles out there, really.
Let's
Maybe
see.
that could be something happening soon, hopefully.
Yeah, I think starting to show up.
There must be a few companies out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's your chair.
Is this
Noisy boy.
terrible?
Yes, I think we've covered most of the calculators. We have sort of an idea of the main questions and the main things we cover. So I'd encourage everyone to try it out.
So we will be including the calculator. Will have the methodology for it, so everyone can go there and really sort of dig through the frequently asked questions, because there's maybe some things we haven't sort of covered at length now, but they'll be included in that part
Yeah,
as well.
Yeah.
But we really encourage people, and we really encourage everyone that's listening and watching to send us questions, because we will be addressing them at some point at a later podcast, and we can also reply to you by email. And if they are that relevant, we can include them, and we keep on building this calculator, right? So the idea is that we are not fail-proof. We did our best, and this is sort of a really great step, and we're quite confident that this calculator is one of the best out there. But yeah, I would love the feedback.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's definitely it. Yeah, there's a lot of people with a lot of expertise in different areas, and so all the feedback is welcome. Like,
It could be good to mention Mark here. Mark helped kick off this process. Mark's one of the members. You had a call with him as well. I had a call with him back in spring as well. So already we had some inputs from some of the members. I think Mark helped some part
Yeah,
of
at
the
the
UK.
beginning we we had a long call, and he was like very helpful going through each category, his thoughts on it, helping me like not forget any part, because he's worked on this kind of thing before, so it was very helpful.
He did
to
something
have
for the UK government, didn't he? I don't remember exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't remember if it was the UK government, but yeah, he's been
He's been involved in the building of carbon calculators, and he had a lot to say about it. So yeah, that was really cool to have a Mossy Earth member input straight from the beginning. And you found the call because you told me that, and you
it
had
was
a call
very
with him
useful.
alone.
Yeah. Also to have like an out, because you're just researching, getting all this information, forming your idea of what's important, but having just another voice really helped me like become confident, because we converged on almost everything. So it was good.
Yeah, so that's we definitely welcoming also all this feedback, and Matt, maybe relate back a bit to the guides now as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking a lot about, calculating our carbon footprint, and it's not just a case of calculating carbon footprint and making that offset. It's also, this is one step in many steps in how we can all reduce our carbon footprint, and that's where our low impact living guides come in handy. They help our members live more sustainably in all the areas that we've talked about today. And also for the guides, if people have ideas, if there's subject areas that they'd like to find out more about, send through some ideas. It's always nice as well. But going back to the calculator, sort of a point we have sort of brushed over is just the user experience. I mean, I've had a couple of goes on it yourself as well. Of course, we're biased, but it looks really, it's clean, it's neat, it's a really nice user experience. It takes 3 to 5 minutes to go through.
And in terms of the outcomes that you can expect from them, so I mean, for a lot of you, you might have already gone through the process. You'll receive an email with about 4 data points, roughly. Just
breaking down the footprint into categories.
Into
the categories
big,
we talked about.
the big categories we talked about.
Yeah.
Yes, but then if we want to go in a bit more depth about this, we're also available to tell you a bit more about the specific answers and or how you sort of scored in a variety of them. So you can, by becoming a member, you can also sort of chat with us about that. We can't make this available for everyone, or we'd get too many emails, but we're available to call and to go over the results in a bit more depth for our Mossy Earth members. And I think just to touch more on a point that Matt, you just said around the low impact living guides, that what we're trying to achieve with the Mossy Earth membership is to include all these different things in one place. So it's not just the planting of trees. It is core to what we do, and it is one of the amazing things that I really enjoy doing. But there's all these other things around it, right? It's about the rewilding side. So we're not just planting trees for the sake of planting trees and capturing carbon. We're doing it for biodiversity purposes. And then we have the low impact living side of things. So we're not calculating on carbon footprint, so we go and plant more trees. We're calculating our carbon footprint, so we understand where we can reduce that. And I think this sort of, the calculator is going to play a really pivotal role in helping us increase that side of things and help people direct them towards where they can make a real impact.
And I'm really hoping that for other people it will be like it was for me, that it's something that you feel like you were overwhelmed, and that now, like, by doing this, you can really have an idea of what you can do. Like
where you stand and what.
You become really confident about like where to devote your energy to. So I really hope that like other people will have the same experience, and I think looking forward to the feedback, I think.
Nice. And for any companies out there listening, if you're looking to calculate your own carbon footprint, we might have Tiago do a little bit of work with you to help around on those things as well. But first and foremost, we're focused on this, creating this fantastic sort of user experience based on the latest research as well.
Yeah, because of course the calculator is also a matter of, we've tried to make it so it can adjust to most people. But then of course, if you find that there's something that doesn't really cover your case, because that can happen, please let us know, and then we can also like take all this feedback into account. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you very much for for all the knowledge, and above all from our side, really thank you a lot for doing all this research.
Yeah, my pleasure.
As I enjoy going through papers, but I think I really noticed a difference in speed of how you sort of tackled things and how things have moved along. And yeah, I think this is going to be sort of a really, really great addition to the work we're trying to do here at Mossy Earth.
Yeah, I'm glad. I hope it's useful, and I really enjoyed the process. So I hope people enjoy using the calculator as well. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Cool. Thank you.
That's a wrap.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to our podcast. I just wanted to let you know that we've included the links for the calculator, the methodology, and the guides in the description of the video. But you can find everything on our website as well, which is mossy.earth. Cool domain, right? Finally, I would like to encourage you all to do your best in reducing your impact on our ecosystems and to advocate for such change among your friends and family, but also in local government or even national government. So, thank you again for listening. This has been the Mossy Earth podcast. I've been Duarte, and I look forward to seeing you all again in the next one. Cheers!